am Dr. Stephanie, and I want to tell you a little bit. I thought I'd do 2 segments on books that I like. Today's segment, I want to talk about books specifically about autism, or formerly Asperger's, or things that I find useful that I might use in my practice. But these would be, I think I've categorized these, all of the ones on my desk here, I think are by non-Christian authors, but still great books in the field. So I'll introduce the one that kind of changed everything for me. This is a very old version of now the new version. Asperger's Syndrome, The Complete Guide of Asperger's Syndrome by Dr. Tony Atwood. This was the one, the original, which this is the one which is just marked up and starred up back when I was searching for resources about Asperger's. I remembered when I was in my graduate school, when I was told about we were being trained on the DSM-4, which is the burgundy book with the gold letters, the DSM-4. Asperger's had been introduced into our diagnostic lexicon. And essentially my training in graduate school was, this is Asperger's. It's kind of like high functioning autism. It's 1 in 10,000 people. You probably won't see anyone like this in your practice, but you need to know it for differential diagnosis of personality disorders. And that was my lesson on Asperger's syndrome. Well, when my daughter was struggling with school and she had been tested when she was 3 and 4 years old and had an incredibly high IQ, genius level IQ, very verbal, putting sentences together even before she was 2 years old. She wasn't developmentally behind when it came to what you're usually looking for on developmental markers. In fact, she was ahead. This thing came to my mind. Asperger's, that thing that I'm never supposed to encounter. I think that's what this is. So this book was the only book at Barnes & Noble that even addressed this concept of Asperger's syndrome. And during that time, there's a picture of my nephew in there. At the end of the book, and I believe it's also in the complete guide, what was so helpful was different standards and guidelines for diagnostic criteria. Now, these might be based on UK or Australia, because some of these inventories, I don't know this for the United States. But this is the original Asperger's syndrome. Then this is the updated version, because in the original book, there was not too much about adults. But in this book, it's been updated. I guess I could look and see when it was updated. But Dr. Tony Atwood is one of the most world-renowned, most well-known researchers in this field. And I feel pretty much if Dr. Tony wrote it, I'm kind of behind it and I'm all in. So this was updated, revised edition. This is 2015. All right, so this was, I think, early 90s. This is 2015. So these I very much recommend if you're really trying to understand what is now called autism level 1, or if you're in a country or a place that still uses Asperger's syndrome. These are great books to get you on your way. Another book that I came across when I was parenting a teenager, also this is Dr. Tony Atwood and Michelle Garnett. This is From Like to Love. This is a very good book talking about the differences of acquaintances and crushes and liking someone and kind of what's appropriate in relationships, and kind of that this is a really good kind of 12 to 18 space. But based on where you are as an adult, if you really don't understand how to show like and love, this might be a refresher course for you. But it is definitely written for parents of preteens, adolescents, and understanding dating and boundaries and all of that good stuff. So I think this is another really great book. If you're really wanting to understand kids, I really love this book, and I had the author of this book, which I also had Dr. Tony, of course, on our show twice. Ask for Kids by Jennifer Cook O'Toole. I think now you're looking for Jennifer Cook. This Ask for Kids book was a really great book, talking about how to get inside the mind and really understand children that are on the spectrum, how to connect with them. She's from an educator background, using her educator background to her personal lived experience, and then having children on the spectrum. This is another really great book that I like. Now, this one I love. We've had Dave Finch on the show as well. Some of the readers don't like to read it because Dave he likes to use colorful metaphors, as Star Trek fans would call cussing, right? So maybe if that's not your cup of tea. But one of the reasons I like this book is Dave Finch, who was originally diagnosed with Asperger's, I believe, doesn't give himself a pass. He identifies on the spectrum, he understands he has neurological differences, but he made a mind shift and a difference that he was going to love his wife well and, be the best Asperger husband that he could be. So I've introduced to you someone on the show, Jeremy Rochford, and I've challenged him to make a Christian's best practices book for the Christian autistic or neurodiverse man, and I think that would be amazing and wonderful. So I am encouraging and calling it into being. But right now, as far as from a male's perspective on kind of understanding the neurodiversity and the changes that were made and how the person made the changes, this is what's there on the market. Now, this one is super heady. This is really meant for clinicians. And if you really want a more heady book, this is Asperger Syndrome in Adults by Stoddard, Burke, and King. If you really want to understand how to diagnose someone who is an adult on the spectrum, or you are trying to get your clinician to get trained or better understand adults on the spectrum, this is a really good book. Even though it's got an old title of Asperger Syndrome, the things that are really important in this book are the different reasons that why men or adults in general on the spectrum are missed. Two of the most missed is a person on the spectrum, of course, coming through adulthood, has learned compensatory strategies and therefore might be masking or using a strategy in the diagnostic process, or the sensory profile is often misunderstood. Most clinicians, especially when you're working with children, tend to be looking for two profiles. That is one who is really sensory seeking and that one who's just really sensory avoidant. But there are 4 profiles. There's some research in this book, and then I looked up that research that's mentioned in this book that talks about there are more than 2 profiles. There is also low sensory or low regulation, which is what my husband is. The world could blow up, the temperature could change. He's not really paying attention to the sensory environment. The sensory environment does not really affect him as much. So there is that one. He'll eat anything. Smells don't bother him. Sounds don't bother him. And so he's not really sensory seeking, but he's more kind of that lower registration. And then we do have sensory avoidant, and then we have like a really hyper sensitive. So there's kind of like my oldest daughter, a little bit of a touch me not. So she's more avoidant. But then there are people who are just kind of so in tune and so aware of sensory, tends to be painful for them. So this is another one of my favorite books, and I'm really relying heavily on a lot of this in some of my research that I'm doing right now. And so again, clinicians, if you really want to understand where you're missing adults on the spectrum, this is a good book. This is an older book, but I do find it's kind of got a pretty good balanced approach. It is Asperger Syndrome, Autism Spectrum Disorder, and Long-Term Relationships. There are some books out there that put too much of the emphasis on the autistic person, and then there's some that put all the attention on the neurotypical wife. And so I think this one has a pretty balanced approach. Again, all of these that I'm mentioning are not Christian authors, so there might be things in the book you and your faith may not be able to adjust to or may not resonate for you. That's okay. But these are some resources that are out there. We want to help bring some Christian resources into this field, which is what we're in progress of doing. But right now, I want to tell you about what's out there. Maxine Aston is another really good resource out there. I've used these 3 books or recommended these 3 books. So this first one has got a lot of things in it for a non-Christian that some of the dating and sexual things are not going to resonate. But as far as just basically, she took, I think, 20, 30 questions that men on the spectrum ask. This one is what men with Asperger syndrome want to know about women dating and relationships. Maxine asked it, forward by Dr. Tony Abbott. She took some questions and just answered it. She is a clinician and she works primarily in this field. I think she has some lived experience as well in a relationship. So she took the questions that specifically AS men were asking and put it in a book form. But she also has the other half of Asperger syndrome to better understand the wife. So back when I started doing a lot of book reading, I would sometimes have the couples read both, so you can kind of better understand how he's thinking and better understand the impact on her. So these are kind of companion books, I think, if you're really seeking to understand how the other person is processing. If you're trying to do some things on your own, maybe you live in a place where you just don't have any form of resource. So this Asperger's Couples Workbook, also by Maxine Aston. If you are really self-motivated and you're like looking for a resource that the two of you want to work together on because you don't have the capacity or the ability to have a coach or a counselor in your life, this is a good one. So again, if you're on the self-help model, understanding each other's perspective and some exercises, this is a good little kind of package deal for you. Also, let me mention, I don't get any money for mentioning any of these books. I just get a lot of emails asking, what books do you like? What books do you not like? Because there's so many on the market, at least from the secular perspective, why spend your money on ones that you might walk away with, where it's just mainly someone's story or narrative. And these books really aren't story or narrative. I do not have my copies with me because they are in my office, but I like Aspergirls. I like social skills or safety skills for the Asperger woman. I like books by Jennifer Cook O'Toole. I've had her on the show, Autism in Heels, and she has Sisterhood of the Spectrum. But those are at my office at the moment. But those are also great books for women, if you're wanting to understand women on the spectrum. And then this has nothing to do with autism or Asperger's at all, but Why Marriages Succeed or Fail, things by Gottman, because Gottman is research-based. And research-based, talking about what leads to marriages succeeding or failing and understanding the skills that you need, the communication skills that you need. It's foundation. So you might not be able to get a lot of practical things that go specifically for ASNT or neurodiverse marriages. But if you do not have a neurodiverse trained therapist near you, starting with a Gottman trained therapist might be beneficial for you. Now, these two books I learned about in graduate school. When I went back to school to get my doctorate in education, I had to pick a master's certification kind of concentration. And I decided that for my clientele, what I needed to learn and be able to help with was communication and conflict resolution skills. And so I learned about these two books. You have worked with me. Thanks for the feedback. You have definitely been asked to read it. Now, I believe Sheila Heen actually is a Christian, and I think there is a workbook component that's called Thank God for the Feedback. And so I think these two combinations, if you work with me, you will be required to get this book at some point in time. It takes communication down to a very basic element of how we give and receive feedback, what our own personal triggers are, how we get triggered when we swing, what each person has a different swing, each person has a different baseline, how to work with each other, how to understand your own, because all you can do is control yourself, understanding your own triggers, understanding why you get so triggered in feedback, and being able to come back down to baseline. There's a little bit in here that talks about how your temperament and neurology might affect that baseline and swing, but it's really not a book about autism or Asperger's. It's a humankind thing that we all need to do better at feedback. Then, if you really are working on some conflict resolution, there's a couple of things in here that are not my favorite. But overall, when it talks about contribution, that's not exactly my favorite. I don't think you should blame someone who's been raped on what she was wearing. So I don't think she contributed to her own rape based on what she was wearing. Those two sentences, let's strike those. But other than that, learning how to understand what each person's thinking, assumptions, expectations. I think this is a companion book to Thanks for the Feedback. So all of the books that I mentioned here, like I said, are usually ones I recommend if someone's asking me about children or women or something for men to read, workbooks, understanding adults on the spectrum. These tend to be my go-to. These are some of the books that I'm relying on for my research. And so I thought I would kind of put that out there and share some of the resources that I highly recommend. So if you're looking for something and you're like, what do I do amongst all of the books and resources that are out there? These are some that can get you started.